The 13th Sunday after Trinity, Almighty and most merciful Father, of whose only gift it cometh, that thy faithful people do unto thee true and laudable service. Grant that we may so faithfully serve thee in this life, until at length we come to our eternal home. In Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Verse 2 of Ascension Hymn 216. Verse 3, God the Creator, the Lord who rulest the earth and the heavens, guard us from harm without, cleanse us from evil within. Hail thee, festival day, blessed day, thou art hallowed forever, when the Christ ascends high in the heavens to reign. We turn our attention to Dr. Archaeology. We noted from his Old Testament and theology his peculiar complaints about Trinitarian thinking and Christomonism, which was most odd, complaining that somehow had to be done away with before he could do Old Testament theology. And a few pontifical claims that not until that's fixed can you do Old Testament theology. And yet he wants his cake and eat it too. He brings that in a little bit later. And it appears on first view to be exegesis by the Weltanschauung rather than by the text itself. Well, we turn now to biblical archaeology, revised and expanded, and we're reading the book blurb in this revised and enlarged edition of his authoritative book. Dr. Wright has made scores of changes throughout to take into account the major excavations and finds since the first edition of 1957. In substantial new additions to chapters 5, 8, 9, and 10, he describes how the history of some of the most ancient, important cities of ancient Israel must be rewritten and revised in the light of the discoveries of recent important campaigns. Particular attention is given to the new findings of Hebrew University expedition to Megiddo under the direction of Yigael Yadin and the Drew McCormick American Schools of Oriental Research expedition to Shechem under the archaeological direction of the author. Revision of the bibliographies at the end of chapters enhance the value of this new edition as an up-to-date further study. The author's central and absorbing interest in the understanding and exposition of the scriptures. He presents the Bible stories set in chronological order as the foundation and continuity for his book. To this story are related all the archaeological discoveries that illuminate biblical history. Dr. Wright covers a tremendous field with awe-inspiring authority and a delightful wealth of material enhanced by over 220 illustrations, detailed drawings, photographs, reconstructions, maps. Superior copies of the number of these pictures are introduced in this edition. Which little-known facts of heritage of Christianity, this book has unlimited fascination. It will offer rich rewards to all readers who have an interest in biblical history and are eager to know the relevance of modern archaeological research to the ancient certainties of the Christian faith. illustrated with 220 drawings, photographs, and maps. I think this was his specialty too, more than theology per se, which is a separate room in the castle, if we can use the castle analogy for the theological structure. Biblical Archaeology, G. Ernest Wright, published by Westminster Press in Philadelphia in 1957, 1962, and that's what this is reprinted, 1966, 1970, 1974, and 1979. So this is a 1962 edition. Forward, Biblical Archaeology, 2 giants in the earth, 3 founding fathers, 4 sojourners in Egypt, 5 conquests, 6 judges, 7 the manner of Israel and manner of Canaan, the golden age, Saul, David, city of David, 9 division and downfall, 10 last days of Judah. He's following a biblical chronology here. I wonder how any commitment to documentarianism factors in. 12, the brand plucked from the beginning. 13, Palestine in the time of Christ. 14, the church in the world. List of illustrations, quite a few of those here, 27. Wow. This is going to be rich, if for nothing else, than the pictures. What would they say, 220? Wow. This is superb. Just superb. This alone justifies reading this book. We're up to 193 there, 220. Then a list of maps. Up to 8. Okay, forward. G. Ernest Wright at McCormick. I thought he was at Harvard. Anyways, the purpose of this volume is to summarize the archaeological discoveries which directly illumine biblical history, in order that the Bible's setting in the ancient world and its relation to its environment may be readily comprehended. The framework of the volume is thus the biblical story, and the subject matter is treated chronologically. That's something we already noted. Yet the book is not meant to be a biblical history. It is simply a supplement thereto. At various points in the text, and especially chapter 7, a small attempt is made to introduce the reader to the large world of comparative theology in ancient time. Yet in neither theology nor history does this volume pretend to be exhaustive. It's introductory and selective, the purpose being to introduce the main areas of inquiry and discovery. The greatest freedom has been used in quoting from biblical translations. I generally began with the AV, but usually revised it. In most instances, therefore, the translations correspond exactly with none of the modern versions. I'm greatly indebted to the following people: Professor W.F. Albright, John Bright, Frank M. Cross, and Floyd Filson, who read various portions of the manuscript and gave me the benefit of their counselor. And then for the typists, McCormick Theological Seminary, Chicago. That was 1955. That was the seminary my father's pastor graduated from in 1908. Down to page. It's only 300 pages, so Biblical Archaeology. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of generation upon generation. Ask thy father, and he will show thee. Thy elders will tell thee. Deuteronomy 32:7. Biblical archaeology is a special armchair variety of general archaeology. The biblical archaeologist may or may not be an excavator himself, but he studies the discoveries of the excavations in order to glean from them every fact that throws a direct, indirect, or even a diffused light upon the Bible. He must be intelligently concerned with stratigraphy and typology, upon which the methodology of modern archaeology rests, and of which more will be said in a later chapter. Yet his chief concern is not with methods or pots or weapons in themselves alone. His central and absorbing interest is understanding and the exposition of the scriptures. You see scriptures? Yes. Biblical archaeology and biblical theology. The Bible, unlike the other religious literature of the world, is not centered in a series of moral, spiritual, and liturgical teachings, but in the story of a people who lived at a certain time and place. Biblical man, unlike other men in the world, had learned to confess his faith by telling the story of what had happened to his people and by seeing within it the hand of God. Faith was communicated, in other words, through the forms of history, and unless history is taken seriously, one cannot comprehend biblical faith, which triumphantly affirms the meaning of history. In reconstructing the history of biblical times, one comes upon many periods which are not well known from the surviving written records. One illustration is the patriarchal period of Israelite life we know from the book of Genesis. Who were these Hebrews? When did they live? How is their movement to be fitted into ancient history? Genesis itself only hints at the answers to these questions. The material within it was passed down orally for many generations before it was committed to writing, and it was necessary for us to recover its original background if we are to answer the historian's questions. This can only be done by archaeological investigation, the results of which we must carefully sift and use, because we have no other means of getting into the period in question. Of course, one might ask, why is all this historical effort necessary when all we need to get from the Bible is its faith and religious ideas? Yet what is biblical faith but the knowledge of life's meaning in the light of what God did in particular history? In the biblical sense, there is no such thing as knowledge of God apart or somehow separated from the real events of this human scene and from the special responsibilities he's given us within it. Faith and knowledge in the Bible are founded in a complete commitment to the God who rules history, and in the loyalty, obedience, and hope which are anchored in him, but which necessitate one's personal and responsible involvement in, not retreat or removal from, the events of history. Furthermore, biblical man could express his faith so confidently because he understood that events he describes really happened. If we are to take him seriously, we must also take his history seriously. And the more we know about it, the more we shall be enlightened by what he says concerning it. His intensive study of the biblical archaeologist is thus the fruit of the vital concern for history which the Bible has instilled in us. We cannot, therefore, assume that the knowledge of biblical history is unessential to the faith. Biblical theology and biblical archaeology must go hand in hand if we are to comprehend the Bible's meaning. And I might add here, again, Old Testament, New Testament, systematics, church history, practical, and contemporary theology. And so far we see with the man, there's no sense of the confession operating. Did it just fly off with the pigeons from the bell tower? Yet the study of archaeology leads the theologian to a considerable and unavoidable risk. What if one should find that the biblical events did not occur at all? That this may happen is the risk that we must be taken. For again, we must say that we cannot understand the nature of the Bible completely unless we know all that we can know about its background. For the most part, archaeology has substantiated and illuminated the biblical story at so many crucial points that no one can seriously say that it is little but congeries of myth and legend. No longer is the situation what it was 150 years ago when, quote, from the chaos of prehistory, the Bible projected as though it were a monstrous fossil with no contemporary evidence to demonstrate its authenticity or its origin in a world like our own. It's got a quote there, but I don't know who it is from. Yet, and a footnote, yet numerous historical problems have arisen, as we shall see in the pages which follow. And in addition, there is in the Bible an interpretation of events and experience which is not subject to historical or archaeological testing. That a violent wave of destruction occurred in southern Palestine during the course of the 13th century is clear from the excavations. That this was caused by the Israelite invasions is a reasonable historical inference. That the warfare was directed by God for his own righteous ends in history, however, an interpretation by faith which is not subject to historical testing. The resurrection of Christ was an inner certainty to early Christians, but that is something which archaeology cannot illuminate. Hence, the biblical archaeologist is definitely limited in the work which he can do. He cannot prove that the Bible is true, but he can and has illuminated the historical setting, the events, and the cultural background with which biblical faith is concerned. In doing so, however, he has found that while the most part he's played a positive role in biblical exposition, he is also to play a negative part on a number of occasions. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this negative role is to be found in the archaeologist's discovery of the antiquity of man's past. Since this discovery is so intimately tied to the development of biblical archaeology, it is necessary that we say a few words about it. That quote was from W.F. Albright. When early Christian scholars reconstructed a history of the world, their chief source was the Old Testament. How old was the earth and the life upon it? Here was a record. Concise and precise, which told them what they wanted to know. The great fathers of the first 3 centuries, knowing little, if any, Hebrew, used the Septuagint or Greek translation exclusively, and from it they learned that the creation of the earth and man was to be placed some 6,000 years before their day. This was indeed interesting to some, for did not God create the world in 6 days? It is not one day with the Lord as 1,000 years. Later scholars, Eusebius and Jerome, studying the Hebrew text itself, were inclined to lower the figure to 4,000 years, but within those limits all were agreed. The history of man is not shrouded in obscurity. It is definite and confined, having begun with the creative act of God between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, and most were agreed also that this creative act was confined to the 6 days of 24 hours each. Such was the commonly held view throughout Christendom until the middle of the last century. Luther, in his commentary on Genesis, declared, "We know on the authority of Moses that longer ago than 6,000 years the world did not exist." Calvin agreed, but Melanchthon, wishing to be more accurate, set the actual date of creation at 3963, the figure varying only a few years from that of Jerome. It was a saintly Irish clergyman, Archbishop Usher, however, who established himself as the greatest authority in the matter in his publication of the Annals of the Old and New Testament. His calculations showed that man was created in 4004 BC. An enterprising publisher included this chronology for the convenience of the reader in the margin of the Authorized Bible or King James Version of the Bible. And like many a marginal note in history, it was soon invested with almost as much sanctity as the text itself, only being omitted with the publication of the Revised Version in 1885. With the Renaissance, however, had come a new interest in pagan antiquity, and during the succeeding centuries, an increasing number of travelers brought reports of ruins still standing in the East. The traditional theory of the age of man could not remain unchallenged by such antiquarian interest. Sir William Raleigh's History of the World, published between 1603 and 1616, contained a premonition of what was to come when it informed the reader that, quote, "In Abraham's time, all the then known parts of the world were developed. Egypt had many magnificent cities, and these were not built with sticks, but of hewn stone, which magnificence needed a parent of more antiquity than these other men have supposed." Succeeding generations saw the development of many branches of science. During the last century, various lines of investigation were converging to drive man's origin back into the dim obscurity of millennia upon millennia. We'll bring it to a close, dealing with all this introduction to biblical archaeology. Ascension Hymn 216, the Spirit of life and of power, now flow in us, fount of our being, light that does lighten all, life that in all dost abide. Hail thee, festival day, blessed day thou art, hallowed forever, day when Christ descends high in the heavens to reign. Let us pray. Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb forever and ever. Amen. Godspeed.